Welcome back to the water cooler, everybody. All right, we now have part two of our interview with Senator Ted Cruz. We aired part one Friday, where the senator talked about President Trump and his COVID diagnosis. Today, he lowers the boom on Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts, saying that Roberts despises, that's his word, despises Donald Trump and has put on a uniform for the left. It's part of our discussion about his new book. It's called One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History. That's where we begin.
I think this issue may well be the single most important issue facing the country in this election. Obviously, when I wrote the book, I didn't know that we would have a Supreme Court vacancy in October, but I knew we had an election in November. And the choice for a great many Americans, myself included, the choice of who the judges will be, and in particular who the Supreme Court justices will be, is the most compelling issue in the election. The way the book is structured, each chapter focuses on a different constitutional right. So we've got a chapter on free speech. We've got a chapter on religious liberty. There's a chapter on the Second Amendment. There's a chapter on U.S. sovereignty. There's a chapter on democracy and elections and Bush versus Gore, and that obviously could prove incredibly relevant if this election in 2020 ends up being a contested election. And with each of the chapters, David, what I do, as you know, before I was in the Senate, I was a Supreme Court litigator. Right. That's what I did for a living, was argue cases in front of the Supreme Court. And so I tell war stories in the book, the inside story of big landmark cases. What I try to do is take the reader behind the curtain, inside the court. You know, for a lot of people, the court, it's important, but they don't necessarily understand how it works. It can be a little bit confusing. This book is designed to try to help get through all of that.
And I thought what was interesting in the book, you really kind of drilled down on why Republicans, or Republican presidents at least, blow it or have blown it in the past when it comes to Supreme Court nominees. Kind of lay out the philosophy as to what in the world happens. How do we get David Souters and Democrats never get a David Souter?
You know, David, it's a great question. The entire last chapter of the book is Supreme Court nominations and how to get it right going forward. And so I review the history of Supreme Court nominations, starting with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Democrats get it right almost 100% of the time. Just about every single Democratic nominee votes exactly the way Democrats want in virtually every case.
Right.
Republicans are terrible at this. We bat worse than 500. Many of the worst judicial activists in history were Republican nominees. Earl Warren, Bill Brennan, John Paul Stevens, David Souter, who you mentioned, Harry Blackmun, the author of Roe versus Wade, all of those were Republican nominees. And what I explain in the book is it's not just random. It's not just a flip of the coin and we keep getting unlucky. There is a clear, discernible pattern between the justices who honor their oaths, who stay faithful to the Constitution, and those who don't. If you look at some of the lions of the court, people like Antonin Scalia, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, my former boss, Chief Justice William Rehnquist, every one of them had served in the executive branch. They had been outspoken conservatives. They had defended constitutional principles. And here's the critical piece. They had suffered withering criticism from the press. They'd been pounded.
That's right.
And they hadn't wavered. That's actually the most important characteristic I'm looking for in a Supreme Court justice is, have you been in the cauldron? Have you faced the heat and held steady and faithful? On the other hand, when Republican presidents nominate a stealth nominee with little to no proven record, but someone says, trust me, they'll be great, virtually without exception, it turns into a disaster.
And let me ask you about Amy Coney Barrett with that in mind, because you talk about making sure these justices that are nominated are in that Scalia-Thomas mold. Do you see her that way? Because, and I want you to talk about her. And I know you're friends with Brett Kavanaugh and, of course, Neil Gorsuch, but there's been some disappointment there, at least to begin with. I mean, it feels like the jury's still out. You go there, Senator, and I thought that was pretty bold of you.
Yeah, in the book, I lay out some significant criticisms of both Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch. And I think it is too early to tell with those two nominations. Typically, a Supreme Court nomination is measured in decades and not just a couple of years.
Right.
David Souter, for example, first couple of years, Souter was actually quite conservative. And then he began galloping to the left, and he ended up the leader of the left on the Supreme Court. But with both Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, I urge the president not to nominate them. And I urge the president instead to nominate Senator Mike Lee.
I was going to ask you about Amy Coney Barrett. Following up on her, do you think she will be confirmed before Election Day?
I do. I think the Senate, we're going to take up the confirmation hearing the week of October 12th. And I believe we have the votes. I think the votes are solid, and I think she will be confirmed by the end of the month before Election Day.
You know, you mentioned in your book, well, you talk about one vote away, and everybody talks about, well, Amy Coney Barrett, that'll be a solid 6-3 conservative bloc. I don't know about that, and I think you would be the first to say, I don't know about a 6-3. I mean, John Roberts has been off the reservation. A month and a half ago, I talked to Vice President Pence, and he said that John Roberts was a, quote, disappointment. That from the Vice President. I'm curious to get your take on John Roberts.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think John Roberts has become the new Sandra Day O'Connor, and it is an unfortunate thing. I talk about John Roberts at considerable length in the book. Right. I've known John 25 years. He was a law clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist, as was I. When he was a practicing lawyer, he was widely considered the finest Supreme Court advocate in the country. But John, I actually think much of what is driving it is I think John despises Donald Trump. I think it's personal. I think it is difficult to come up with two human beings more antithetical than John Roberts and Donald Trump in every respect about everything about their person. Right. I think Roberts, Roberts at his confirmation hearing, he famously gave the example. He said a judge should be like an umpire, simply calling balls and strikes. And unfortunately, what Roberts has done in the last couple of years is set aside his role as an umpire, and he stood up and put on a team's uniform, and he's grabbed a bat, and he is swinging away.
You know, that's a big deal. Obviously, Ted Cruz saying that about, first of all, a longtime friend, John Roberts. In addition to that, I mean, look, he's a U.S. senator, and he's not a pundit. So anytime Ted Cruz saying those words, it's going to be a big deal, and indeed it is on justthenews.com. That story is trending. Check it out there.